good to go? Fantastic. Well, before I jump right into it, I will make one quick note that Andrea was unable to join us today. She is unwell. However, Megan, thank you for stepping in at the very, very last minute. We appreciate that. Ready to rock? Let's
Sure.
go. I'm going to begin by making a statement which I generally probably wouldn't make on stage and would reserve for a class that I would be teaching on threat intelligence. But I'm going to make it nonetheless. I think today we find ourselves in a situation where a nation can get hit and attacked without a single soldier making their way physically into your border. And while this reality is not one that I would typically start a session with, I think it's important. In this session, we might make a few political inferences. The idea over here is not to stand on one side or the other, it's to present the reality as we see it. I'll say this again that we've been talking about national defense from a land, seas, and skies perspective. But if the last 90 days have taught us anything, and if you've been listening in to a variety of the press conferences, we're now talking about land, seas, skies, and cyber. Joining me on stage, we have individuals with perspective from CSIS, from large corps like Microsoft, from organizations like NATO. And I hope that their expertise, coupled with my healthy diet of butter chicken and Bollywood, we will have a pretty interesting 25 to 30 odd minutes. And I'm going to ask the AV team to keep me true to time by making sure that I have a timer here to ensure that I stay within that limit. Manfred, I want to begin with you, and if you can obviously take about 30 seconds to introduce yourself, but I'm going to hit straight to the point. We talked about this notion of plausible deniability, proxy hacktivists. And in this age of cyber warfare coupled with AI, speed is the new currency. Does forensics even matter now, given the speed of these attacks and the motivations of them? We'll start you off with that question, and why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Yes. So thank you so much. I'm very, very excited to be here. My name is Manfred Budro-Dema. Up until very recently, I was the CIO and CISO of NATO, an assignment that came to an end 5 years. We all have end dates stamped onto our heads, and so mine came, and I had to leave the building. But it was a wonderful, wonderful job that I miss now every day. And so since then, I've been spending my time speaking at fantastic events like this one, a bit of teaching, a bit of consulting. But so to answer your question, does forensics still matter? And I think it does. I think where it matters is if it happens fast. And that is going to be, I think, an underlying theme that goes through everything that we do. The speed has just increased tremendously. So we have an attack cycle that is getting faster and faster, and AI certainly contributes to that. And new parts, new capabilities of AI, like MISAs, certainly contribute to that. And where we need to get to as defenders is to match our speed and to equalize that speed. And so, yes, forensics matter if they're done fast. And we need to be very creative in thinking about how we can make things faster through automation, through AI that is helping on the good side to kind of be a counterpoint to the attacks that we're seeing.
I'll work with that a little bit, and since you mentioned forensics does matter, and attribution doesn't happen at the same speed anymore.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that we want to unpack as we go a little bit forward. But for an opening comment, there's two or three things that I'll use to come back with. So bear with me, Manfred, while I take a jump to Terry, and Terry, or Captain T, as we like to call you. One of the things you've said that is top of mind for you right now is the notion of how living off the land attacks have changed as a result of what you're seeing with the AI tools that are available. Why don't you take a few minutes, tell us a little bit about what you do, and also
Sure.
why was this a very important subject for you.
Yeah, for sure. Terry, I'm a 20-year veteran of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Worked a number of years with our cyber investigations unit out of Toronto. And I'm now part of our internal security group, looking at RIT and physical security, blending it all together from more of a like corporate security officer perspective. And regardless of the role, living off the land, there's two key elements that have evolved from there is the detection. And I'm going to highlight some of the government experts' recommendations on how you can better detect some of these living off the land attacks to mitigate it, and then the implications that it has with AI. So bear with me on this. Because of my background, I sometimes have to rely on notes because I have a very granular line between what I can and can't say. So some of the stuff that's in my mind, I need to filter, unfortunately. Um, we look at attack or defending against living off the land attacks, because the malicious commands are native, traditional signature based security is usually ineffective. As such, these are the following three top recommendations. Privilege restrictions limit the administrative rights and accesses to powerful built in utilities. Now, easily said, but now when we take that into modern AI, agentic AI, obviously there's a bit of a conflict here. A lot of these want to operate with God administrative access, but that also then becomes a bit of a risk there. So, how you navigate and mitigate those risks in that decision making process of privilege escalation, and whether or not you feel you're going to be targeted by some of these state level Russian and Chinese are the two prominent ones that we're aware of that had evolved to these living off the land, trying to really make traditional detection difficult. The second recommendation is behavioral monitoring, establishment of baseline normal activity and deployment of endpoint detection and response. So we've heard for years we need to know what's on our system, right? Where are our endpoints? Where do they reside? And what state are those endpoints? So that we know what the vulnerabilities are. But now you have to layer on top of that what and have that depth of knowledge. What does my organization's behavioral patterns look like? So if we have these administrative rights, these living off the land techniques, which ones do we commonly utilize? What time are they utilized and by whom are they utilized, so that you can then have detection of anomalous behavior? So you can start to get, I know there's some really powerful AI tools out there that can then assist with this anomalous detection of behaviors. The final one that the experts, not myself, because this is just some of what our organizations are telling us, is the detailed logging. Um, all of this with the continuous logging to be able to go back forensically looking at some of the activity that gets flagged to determine, is this common, is this, is there a rationale for this log behavior? These last two are now complicated with the pace of AI and the added requirement for continuous threat exposure monitoring. It's not necessarily good enough to do your standalone audits, your pen tests once a year. That is singular points at time. Now it's moving to not only endpoint detection, but this continuous threat exposure modeling and understanding of what your risks are at any time of the day.
Sounds good. I'm going to work with a few of those items. And for those who can socially engineer your way into my LinkedIn or WhatsApp, you can send me questions here. Two people already did. So thank you for them. There was one question, which I won't bring up right now, but I'm going to get you to think about it a little bit.
Sure.
And that was the evaluation of vendors coming in,
Yeah.
especially those with AI capabilities. But we'll leave that for a couple of questions later on. Thank you for that. Lots to work with. Megan, I want to come and bring a question straight to you. And without stepping away from any of the references that I promised I would make, over the last 90 days, we've seen the evolution of deepfakes. We've seen individuals present themselves as doctors on Truth Social and diplomacy by Truth Social. But as you're seeing all of this and you're seeing how the narrative is being shaped, deep fakes and the reality of all of these are becoming genuine security concerns because they lead cognitively to certain types of actions. You have, for a very long time, as a solutions architect, looked at the technical element of how you architect solutions. But from a human perspective, has cyber awareness and cyber training, given what we're now seeing with these tools by AI, etc., is it changing in any way? Is the human element of engagement in cyber shifting, or is it not shifting at all and it needs to? Megan?
It's a really good question. I think we're not shifting fast enough when it comes to preparing the individuals who, especially within organizations, are going to have to deal with the deep fakes. We have our IT desks. I know we were talking about this beforehand. Our HR teams, these are not threat hunters. These are not forensics individuals who are working within these capabilities to understand why this level of manipulation might be happening, and that we're not thinking of individuals necessarily, if we think of the North Korean aspect, when people were being hired, we're increasing our insider risk significantly just through a hiring process, which is not something outside of cybersecurity we really had to think of before. And when we think of the general public, our awareness for misinformation and what these deep fakes are causing is not broad enough, right? So I think it comes to a two-pronged approach. As a technologist, I think we should have technology that's assisting with this. But from a human aspect, which we always need to lead with empathy, we have to move beyond awareness and training. We need to move into either gamification or deeply involving and integrating specific teams that sit outside of cybersecurity traditionally with them to create a more tighter defense, especially when it comes to our HR and our hiring processes.
I was just going to add to that, and bang on, is that it's a collaborative effort. It's establishing we talk about security by design within cybersecurity now with software programming and all of programming. But when you step back from a corporate level perspective, you need to have that collaboration of security matters at all parts of the corporate entity now. We're seeing what was predominantly, we're always thinking of that remote risk, right? The remote threat through our firewall, to steal a friend's quote in part, but it's also bringing the physical, the close access. So the deep fakes are also from credentials. So when you look at supply chain, I was reading articles recently about how adversaries are starting to deep fake credentials, architectural stamps. So now it's the trust factor of your vendors, again, taking it out there. Is this legit? How do we do our due diligence from a corporation breeding security amongst all departments, HR, IT, and physical security working together collaboratively? Security as a collaboration within an organization is key these days.
I think there's one other thing that falls into that, and that I hope that machines will never be able to replace. And that is the human intuition.
Mhm.
That is, does something pass the smell test? Does it feel right? There's sometimes you look at a particular scenario and you get a feeling, and that feeling you only get as a human. And that already then signals that that is potentially an issue and that needs to be raised and it needs to be looked at. So the human intuition part, it really needs to be fostered more in this entire machine, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity concept.
Agree.
So we have about 20 minutes to go, and I want to now punch at a couple of those very, very particular questions. And Megan, and yourself, Terry, you brought up the concept of you have to work closely with HR, the deep fakes concepts. For those that do not know about it, was released last year at RSA, the 500 North Korean operatives that ended up getting jobs at various tech firms in the United States, potentially in the Canadian space as well. For those of us that work closely with HR, you're seeing more of these within the Canadian context as well. Maddie's going to kill me, but I cannot help myself. 2 weeks ago, they invited me out to Windsor where we were talking about this. And in one of the scenarios, somebody proclaimed, yep, HR stands for human remains for exactly this reason, which was a very interesting conversation. But I'll discuss that some other time. But Captain Manfred, NATO, a question that just came in, and I'm trying to be very cautious in how I word this, but I know I see one of my mentors in the room, Vivek, and he would encourage me to ask this question. All these tools that are now available to citizens, and I know we didn't have this in the script, but I told you it was coming. All these tools available to citizens now where they can create these deepfakes, where they can write some of this malware as well. Does it change the legal context as well and how governments are now telling citizens about what they can and cannot do? The question very directly even was stating something to the effect of, you cannot commit a physical harm to someone. From a cyber perspective, does our language now have to change given the context we find ourselves in?
Hmm. So I don't think you need to be that careful in asking the question, but one needs to be very careful in answering the question.
Fair enough.
That's really where the care comes in. But listen, NATO is not a regulatory body, right? We're not a government. We're not that. We are a defensive organization where we deal in deterrence and defense. Having said that, I still have an opinion as to what governments should do. I think there is a lot of gray and increasingly more gray in this area when it comes to things like offensive cyber, right? That's really kind of the concept that we're going to. And even the conversation between NATO nations are a bit divided. There are nations that traditionally have got a very defensive role. So NATO also does not do offensive cyber, right? We're a defensive organization, but various member nations can do that. And so I think it's something that we should very seriously look at because we find ourselves in a fight with an adversary, and the adversary has got a lot of methods available to them that we don't have. And I think we really need to seriously think about, do we need to expand our current framework? When is an offensive action still a defensive action, and it's still true to the morals of the Western society, right? That we all believe in. But it's kind of an interesting concept of how do we expand our thinking in this new world a bit.
Okay.
If I can,
Yep.
So again, my organization, not law enforcement. However, have a fair bit of exposure to the Canadian cyber criminal ecosystem, working with domestic partners. The laws don't necessarily need to change. Possession and development of tools for nefarious purposes is not a crime in Canada. The basic laws are still valid regardless of the AI tools and the pace of which it's deployed. If you are accessing unauthorized systems, that's the criminal offense. So whatever the tool, whatever the pace, that doesn't change for Canadian law. But there is an onus now with, I think, more pressure on Canadian agencies, whether it's law enforcement, my own, our CSE neighbors, to act at a pace of the threat. And you were talking earlier about the role of forensics and moving from whack-a-mole and always being out there after the attack. The onus needs to be on how you can be more preventative, and that then crosses the line and starts to gray the area between offense and defense. So as early detection as possible for our organizations to disrupt the capabilities. So this is a key one, disrupting the capabilities of our adversary before they are in place to take action themselves. So there's always that window where they're deploying, whether it's a development and propagation of a botnet, right? So that takes time in and of itself to get to a critical mass before it can actually be weaponized. So now there's that opportunity for agencies and organizations, as well as in the private sector. InfoSec companies play a huge role in assisting with the detection of this behavior that is preceding attack. We saw with some of the APTs where, yes, it was after the fact that they've actually got deployed on systems, and it's believed to be pre-staging.
Right.
but it's now how do we disrupt that capability before it becomes weaponized? And I think there's a greater onus on government agencies, specifically some of the ones I mentioned, to quicker and take decisive action. To that point, we have worked collaboratively very effectively in this space. There was publicly disclosed last year an example of where my organization and a number of partner agencies were working in that space and actively, offensively disabled and dismantled the capabilities prior to attack. So is that sort of, if we're inoculizing a system, for example, is that offense or defense? Semantics, right? But it's a little bit more in that offensive place. We're not just coming forensically after the fact, trying to figure out what the adversary is doing. We're detecting it and disrupting it before the kill switch is being activated.
I think it's a great example, because that is precisely the type of actions that we need to get in a bit more, right?
Yeah.
Be more assertive um, in our fight against cyber attackers.
So I just want to work with that. We have about 10 minutes to go, and I want to stay true to time because I see the next panelists are here as well. And I also see my colleague, Dr. Ali, here as well. You know, I'll make a comment on this, which I know is not a very popular one, but in my own academic work, and we teach at a variety of institutions, a question that has now come up is everyone that's also learning cyber defense and attack techniques as well needs to go through a check and be validated as well, given the amount of power that sits within them.
Yeah.
And I firmly do believe, even at the undergraduate level, that that is something, given nation state environments that we find ourselves in, the movement of operatives as well. This is something that we probably need to discuss. It's not a very popular discussion, especially in unionized environments, but it's one that I think needs to be had. But I'll come to that very shortly. Manfred, and then Megan will go to you. Manfred, you've mentioned this to me in passing that under the CSE Act, Canadians can act offensively. Based on your little engagement with us so far, you think this country is ready for offensive action from a cyber perspective? And what are the ramifications of taking those steps?
So I think the word offensive is a very, very big word, right? Because we talked earlier about the gray area. And I think there is an opportunity for nations to act more assertively in terms of preventing attacks, in terms of getting intelligence about threat actors that then can be used in an effective defense. So while I'm not a proponent of governments breaking into systems and causing destructions and doing things, that is one side of offense, I think that there is an assertiveness in that could be called offensive cyber to a point that is really necessary for an effective defense. And so is the country ready for that? I think absolutely. To move the needle just a bit more into this proactiveness, assertiveness phase.
A diplomatic answer also couched in FIFA speak. Defense, offense, attack. I liked it. Well done. Which team are you rooting for in FIFA?
I can't even begin to have an opinion. I'm not a football fan.
My team choice is based on food, and I've started loving Iraqi food, so I hope Iraq does really, really well.
Very good.
But we'll see where that goes. Any Iraqis in the room? First time Iraq made it. Last night I ordered from Sumac Grill, the best ever, but that's a separate discussion altogether. Terry, question you were going to add to this?
All I was going to say was, oh my God, what was I going to say? On the offensive, is using one of the areas that's opened up for us was what our adversaries have created. When we looked at obfuscation, we talked, one of your first questions was about proxy groups. So proxy groups, whether it's the infosec companies of some of the hostile states, right? They started leveraging them both for defensive purposes and offensive purposes. When they start leveraging, for example, the Chinese government leveraging some of these Chinese infosec companies that have been named, it obfuscates responsibility. It makes it less capable for NATO nations, which if one of these countries wanted to attack our critical infrastructure would normally have been considered an act of war. Article 5 retribution, for example, if the Russians hit our critical infrastructure directly. However, if it's an infosec company, it's not a state actor, it lowers that geopolitical threat, right? So from an appetite and a risk perspective, maybe we don't necessarily offensively go at disrupting critical infrastructure of our adversaries in that, but they definitely open the window, I think, for accessing what are the capabilities and intentions and intel from the non-government entities that don't have that level of protection, that are assisting and then enabling some of our hostile capable states. Is an area where, if we're going to move more into the offensive realm, staged risk mitigation, these are some of those areas where maybe it's a little bit more palatable for Canadians to play in from an offensive perspective.
I'll work with that. We've got about 6 minutes to go, and there's two more questions. One that also came in, and I'll try to weave it in. Megan, I'll bring this to you. With your work on the vendor side of things, one conversation we're seeing is this notion of, so if a particular tool, an AI tool given
Yeah.
to you by a vendor, is used and weaponized in different ways. I see the cyber X team. I got 7 minutes. Thank you. And it's weaponized in different ways. The question comes up is, well, who's to blame? Is it those who created the tool or those who used it? What are you seeing from a vendor perspective, TPRM standpoint? Anything has changed, especially with the capacity of these AI tools?
I think I'm gonna have to take the politically neutral approach
That's
on
fine.
that one. But I think there's a responsibility model that has to be upheld by both parties. If you are going to, and I work within many of our clients within Canada with Microsoft and our cybersecurity products and the evolving landscape of AI within that. And there is an audit and a risk assessment you do have to take, right? I don't think we have the luxury of not using AI within our cybersecurity practices anymore. It's not scalable without it. We're doing a disservice to our security engineers and our SOC teams. So there has to be an auditing and a government level perspective to when like CSE will put stamps on whether they
Right.
think something should be approved or used, or if there's a base level assessment of if we want to bring these toolings in to our environment. But from the vendor perspective, you have to be doing your due diligence. If something is coming up, if there's a CBE that needs to be published at a rate that maybe we weren't seeing before, and people were not disclosing vulnerabilities quite as quickly. So there is a responsibility as a vendor to provide more safeguarding, I think, than there was before, especially as we move into these multiple modality agents that are performing autonomously within our environment. So you have to be held accountable to a certain point for what you're allowing within your environment. You need to be taking assets and inventories of what's occurring and what permissions you're allowing these tools to have. But at the same time, it's okay to hold your vendors at point and say, I need an auditing trail of how you're going to prepare.
Well, just jump in very quickly, and then Terry, I'll go to you, and we have 5 minutes, so we'll keep it as short. Just for the audience, just last week, I got to have a conversation with the folks from Canada Health Infoway, and I thought their sandboxing environment, especially from an AI perspective, and giving a stamp of approval, and I don't know what the weight of that stamp is, but how they were testing, complementing NIST RMF and a bunch of other techniques, was very interesting in terms of changing how vendors can be integrated within healthcare and get approved. I think this, when you talk about speed, the shift that we're now seeing in the CVE space, even from an academic perspective, now rewriting the way in which we teach about CVEs significantly. Very quickly, Jerry, you had something to add, and then I'll come to the final
Built upon what
question.
we talked about before, cybersecurity needs collaboration when we're talking about corporate governance and liability. Liability, due diligence, and reasonability, right? But it's a legal term. How many of us are lawyers, right? We may work once in a while with breach lawyers. You have them on staff. You may have corporate legal on staff. Collaboration. We talked about HR, physical security, legal. All this liability, we can assume certain things, but what is the current state of Canadian jurisprudence as it relates to this? There's a tremendous amount every day of legal decisions being made on corporate liability in the cyber realm. Are you keeping up with it? Or is your legal team keeping up with it? Is nobody keeping up with it? Who is keeping up with it? So all that to say, collaboration at the corporate level as you're reducing that liability risk goes into that play. Is our Canadian courts and judicial system prepared to understand, comprehend, and make sound legal decisions on cybersecurity liability? Are the judges up to speed on this to make these type of
Right.
important decisions? What kind of decisions are being made? How does that impact your particular industry from a liability perspective? All this is, we often have the security mindset. Security is a team effort nowadays.
Yeah, and in terms of keeping speed and all the changes and the knowledge base that you need, I think it's Estonia that has, I believe it's the country of Estonia that has a minister that's an actual AI. And I think that's something looking. I might be getting the country wrong, but talking about the knowledge base that's required at the back end MCPs that you need to be at that level, I think that development is very, very interesting. That takes you into a whole different set of discussions around CloudBot and whatever have you, but that is perhaps for another time. Last question, and very quickly, Manfred, I'll start with you. Closing comments from Megan and then from Terry, and very quickly. You've heard a lot of talk right now about liability. Very straight up question for you. You're seeing it today, whether it's how drones are being operated, whether it is how different attacks are being conducted, third parties are being, things are being planted back doors. You've seen kinetic explosions happen as a result. Slightly off script, but it's come to me a few times. If there's one thing folks need to be aware of in terms of cyber warfare going into the future, one thing that really has got your attention, what would that be?
The one thing, the human must be in the loop and the human must remain in the loop.
Fair enough. I'll take that and work with that. Megan, one thing that folks need to be aware of in terms of maybe the next 30, 60, 90 days from a cyber warfare perspective. Anything that comes to mind? I know I'm putting you on the hot seat, but anything that comes to mind.
I think from a organizational perspective and what I've seen over the last 3 months, especially, is we need to put leashes here. This is going to go a little off the cuff. There needs to be some leashes on our developers and our developer tools we're allowing, and how that's propagating within our security teams, and specifically to the point of how we need to enable our security teams to have stronger, um, maybe stronger relationships with our developer teams in terms of how we're developing agentic models and how developer teams are using models without us knowing.
Fair.
And I think we're going to see an increase in risks and maybe some issues happening down the line. But we're also going to see really amazing things coming out. So
Final word, Captain CISO. Let's go.
I would just put it out there. It's our collective responsibility to prepare this country to deal with and respond to the threats. We have the awareness of the technology. I think it's beholden upon us to collaborate with various stakeholders to position this country to best utilize, enable, and defend against these particular threats. Every tool that we're developing for our benefit, those agentic tools to assist with our technology, are dual use. So we need to best prepare the country, prepare our folks that are maybe not quite as aware of the potential misuse.
Well, I guess that comes to me for the final word, and to wrap it all up, and taking a leaf from all of your books, I'm going to be very diplomatic. And then because I see Chris Roberts in the room, that diplomacy leaves the room, especially this evening with Unfiltered. When you said anybody's a lawyer, he raised his hand. Anybody's a forensic expert, he raised his hand. So just go to him for everything that you need. Look, diplomatically speaking, if I have to put this all together, then the one thing that I will say is that at the 1 p.m. session or 1:30 that I have with Vivian, Emerson, and a couple of other leaders, I'm going to go deeper into the realities of what you're walking into, specifically unpacking the case around pig butchering scams. And when I go through that, here's the reality that I'm going to say from an academic perspective. I think everyone right now teaching security in Canada needs to realize that this isn't just, hey, this is how you write some code and secure it. You have to genuinely realize that security is war, it is warfare. And you have to be prepared to realize that if you are going to step into this field, it is a matter of national defense. And how we talk about security, how we articulate it, is going to be extremely, extremely important. Not a very popular perspective, but I will say this, and I know recruiters will not like it, especially in the universities and the colleges. But vet every institution, vet every student that comes in to learn, simply because you can now write malicious code simply by saying out loud what you want it to do. And with that, I'll bring us to a conclusion by saying one thing that I said at a board meeting last week. Canada will not defend because of security by apology, but security by design. Thank you, my panelists, and back to Robert.